Early on the morning of the 18th of November, 1979, Appalachian mountain fog blanketed the Cumberland forest slopes. The cold air cut into the skin. Wind slipped through the bare treetops, sounding like the heavy breath of a land that had witnessed too much loss. A logging crew arrived at the work site before dawn. They carried hot coffee, thick jackets, and thoughts of a long day's labor. No one spoke much. In these mountains, mornings always began in silence, but only minutes after turning into the clearing, every sound seemed to drain away. 13 men lay motionless in the forest opening. Not in the chaotic sprawl of sudden collapse. They had been arranged. The bodies formed a rough arc, all facing an abandoned cabin. Its wooden door, long rotted, its roof collapsed years before. As if they had been forced to witness something in the final moments of their lives. Many had been shot at close range. Some bore signs of restraint. The ground beneath them was torn up, marked with drag marks and evidence of struggle. This was not a spontaneous shooting, not a moment of blind rage. Everything pointed to something slow, deliberate, unfolding over hours in the freezing night. The loggers stood frozen in place. One man's hands shook as he dropped his hat. Another turned away and retched. In Appalachia, men are accustomed to hard labor, to accidents, to death. But no one is accustomed to a sight like this. 13 lives taken not in haste, not in chaos, but like a sentence already decided. Fog continued to drift between the tree trunks. The forest birds fell silent. The stillness was so complete that one could hear the beating of their own heart. A land once used to settling conflicts with words, with glances, with honor, now stood mute before the terrible consequence of violence. In that moment, Harlan County faced more than a mass killing. It faced the collapse of trust, trust in community, trust in law, trust that no matter how deep the conflict, it would stop short of taking human life. That morning, in the cold mountain mist of Appalachia, people understood that there are nights when honor, poverty, and despair go too far. And the price was not only 13 deaths, but a wound that would never heal in the memory of an entire mountain region. Harlan County lies tucked into the southeastern corner of Kentucky, where the Appalachian ridges stack upon one another like layers of old, half-told memories. Here, roads do more than lead home, they lead backward into the past. Every bend, every hollow, carries the stories of generations who lived, endured, and learned to remain silent. By 1979, Harlan County was growing weary. The coal mines that had once sustained thousands of families were closing one by one. Machines were hauled away. Jobs vanished. The young left the mountains, carrying with them the last hopes of many households. Those who stayed did so not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else to go. In Harlan, land is more than property. It is ancestry. It is graves. It is a promise, passed from one generation to the next, to hold on to what the fathers left behind. The forest is more than timber. It offers shelter. It holds the water. It preserves the dignity of the people who depend on it. The law exists here, but it is not always present. The police station is far away. Roads are difficult. When help is needed, it can take hours, sometimes days to arrive. And so people learn to settle matters themselves, not with paperwork, but with words. Not in courtrooms, but through honor. In Appalachia, a promise is worth more than a signature. A handshake carries more weight than a seal. Once a man gives his word, he is expected to keep it, even when it costs him dearly. And when someone feels betrayed, the wound is not written on paper, but cut deep into the heart. Honor in Harlan County is quiet. It does not seek attention, but when challenged, it can turn merciless. People avoid open confrontation. They warn with glances. They remind with half-spoken words. And when all those signals are ignored, violence does not arrive like a sudden storm. It comes like something long foretold. Families live side by side for generations. They know who owes whom, who helped whom through a brutal winter, who turned away when hardship struck. Everything is remembered. No ink, no documents, no proof. It was within this tight space, where poverty strangled choice and honor stood above compromise, that the seeds of conflict began to grow. Not with gunfire, but with silence. Not with immediate hatred, but with the feeling of being disrespected. Harlan County is not a land of monsters. It is a place of ordinary people trying to live by what they were taught. But sometimes, the very rules that once helped a community survive become the forces that push it to the edge. And when that happens, the mountains do not intervene. They only stand and watch, as they have for hundreds of years. James Wesley Collette was 43 years old, a man of the logging industry. He was not born in Harlan County. He came from Bell County, where the forests were just as thick, but people were accustomed to speaking in contracts rather than glances. To Collette, the woods were a livelihood, numbers that had to add up, schedules that had to be met, and a reputation built on keeping his word with partners and workers alike. Collette had a wife. He had 2 school-aged children. He had spent more than 20 years in the trade working as a sawman, hauling timber in cold rain, sleeping in makeshift camps deep in the forest. He was no stranger to hardship. But he believed in order. He believed that once 2 sides had agreed, once the signatures were set down, everything was meant to move forward. In the spring of 1979, Collette saw Poor Fork as an opportunity. 300 acres of hardwood forest, oak and walnut, enough to salvage a contract hanging by a thread, enough to keep jobs for the men waiting for his call, enough to prove that he was still a reliable operator in an industry shrinking by the day. When he met with local families, Collette spoke in his own language: prices, timelines, phased payments. He believed clarity was the best way to avoid trouble. But in Harlan County, clarity on paper did not always mean consent in the heart. Collette did not fully understand the tangled relationships among family branches. He could not sense the fractures that had been smoldering for years. To him, having one person sign on behalf of the others was normal practice. To them, it could be a line crossed beyond forgiveness. He did not think he was taking anything away. He believed he was bringing money to families who needed it. He believed he was creating work. He believed he was doing the right thing. And in Collette's world, doing right by a contract also meant doing right morally. But that very belief made him an outsider. Not because he was evil, but because he viewed Appalachia through the lens of someone used to solving problems with paperwork. When opposition surfaced, Collette did not see the fear of losing land, he saw obstruction. When challenged, he did not feel wounded honor, he felt professional insult. Collette did not know that, in this place, some things cannot be negotiated with money. And he did not know that every step forward he considered reasonable was pushing someone else deeper into the dark corner of despair. The Hensley and Brock families were not unfamiliar names in Harlan County. They had lived here for generations, building homes along the mountainsides, farming steep plots of land, raising children on whatever the forest would allow. Their houses stood close together, yet each life carried its own burden, quiet, persistent, and heavy. By the late 1972, poverty was no longer a surprise. It showed itself in sparse meals, in medical bills, with no clear way to pay them, in the eyes of men who had lost their jobs when the coal mines shut down. Money became a shared anxiety, but also something rarely spoken aloud. In Appalachia, endurance was valued more than complaint. The 300 acres of forest were more than shared property. They were a final lifeline. To some, selling the timber meant a chance to pay debts, fix leaking roofs, buy medicine. To others, it was too great a trade, an unacceptable risk of losing what protected their families from harsh winters and an uncertain future. Luther Hensley, the eldest in the family line, viewed the forest through the eyes of a tired man. He saw time running short. He saw struggling children and grandchildren. He felt responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. When money was placed on the table, he did not see betrayal. He saw a chance for everyone to breathe a little easier, even if only for a while. But not everyone saw it that way. Some felt they had not been consulted. Others doubted the true value of the land. And there were those who believed money would come and go, but land, once lost, was gone forever. Family meetings grew tense. Words became heavier. Silences stretched longer than usual. Money began to divide people who had once depended on one another to survive. It exposed cracks that had existed for years, small injustices buried over time. Who received more? Who signed for whom? Who had the right to decide? These questions were no longer just about a contract. They were about trust. Inside those aging wooden homes, no one believed a business agreement could lead to tragedy. They thought only of tomorrow, of how to get through the coming winter. But the moment money entered the picture, the family ceased to be a single unit. And once division took hold, it quietly prepared the ground for something far worse, something no one was yet clear-minded enough to see. Dalton Hensley was 39 years old, born and raised in Harlan County. He needed no map to move through the woods. Every trail and every creek was tied to memories from childhood, when he followed his father into the forest to cut timber. To Dalton, land was not an abstract idea. It was where he built his home, buried his dead, raised his children, and placed his own sense of worth. Dalton had worked as a logger. He understood the value of every trunk, every stretch of forest. He knew what good timber was worth, and he also knew what careless logging could leave behind. So, when he heard that the family land might be cut for years on end, his reaction was not excitement, but caution. He did not see an agreement. He saw danger. Danger of losing control. Danger of outsiders stepping in and deciding the fate of land his family had protected for generations. In Dalton's mind, signing a contract without consulting everyone was not only legally wrong, but a personal insult. Dalton believed his family was being pressured not with force, but with poverty. He believed people had taken advantage of them at their weakest to seize what mattered most. And once that belief took hold, it spread quickly, turning suspicion into anger, worry into resolve, to defend the land at any cost. In Appalachia, honor does not need to be declared. It is shown through action. Dalton did not speak much. He stood at the boundary lines. He blocked roads. He used his presence to say that this was not a place anyone could enter at will. To him, backing down was not compromise, it was admitting he had been wrong to let things go this far. Dalton did not see himself as a troublemaker. He saw himself as the last person still standing up for his family. Every objection he raised was aimed not only at the contract, but at the feeling of being disregarded. And when that feeling went unheard, it slowly hardened into the belief that only force would make others stop. In Dalton's mind, this was no longer about money. It was about who had the right to decide what happened on that land. And once he believed his family's honor was under threat, he was willing to go farther than anyone else. Not because he loved violence, but because he saw no other way to protect what he held sacred. The gunshot rang out on a gray afternoon. It was not aimed at anyone. The bullet buried itself in a tree trunk just a few steps from the logging crew. The sharp crack echoed off the mountainside and bounced back, silencing the entire forest. For those who were there, the moment seemed to stretch on forever. Dalton Hensley did not appear. There was no declaration, no direct confrontation, only a message delivered with unmistakable clarity. In Appalachia, a shot like that is not a prank. It is the final warning before things slip beyond control. The loggers returned with pale faces. Some quietly packed up their gear. Others said they were not being paid enough to risk their lives. Fear spread quickly. No one wanted to become the next victim in a conflict they did not truly understand. Colette reported the incident to the police. A file was opened. Statements were taken. But Harlan County at the time lacked manpower, time, and decisiveness. A shot that did not hit anyone was not enough to trigger a hard response. Officers visited the site. They talked. They issued reminders. Then they left. Law in these mountains was like a thin coat in winter, nice to have, but hardly enough to keep you warm. Once the police departed, their presence faded quickly, replaced by older rules that had existed long before any written statute. Dalton understood that. Colette was beginning to realize it as well. One side believed the law would protect legitimate business. The other believed that when the law failed to act forcefully, people were left to protect themselves. That gap was never filled. It only widened. The warning shot did not stop the work. It only made everything tighter, more strained. Every time a chainsaw roared to life, hearts beat faster. Every shadow at the edge of the forest made someone clench their hands a little harder. When the law becomes powerless, unnamed rules return to take control. And in that heavy atmosphere, violence no longer feels unthinkable. It becomes a visible possibility, hanging over every step, waiting for a moment dark enough to fall. They were no strangers to the forest. 13 men followed James Wesley Colette each day, carrying chainsaws, drag lines, and lunches, hurriedly wrapped in newspaper. They were someone's father, someone's husband, the men who left home each morning promising to be back before dark. In later records, they would be called victims. Before that, they were simply working men trying to get through the day. Some had just lost their jobs in the coal mines, and barely had time to adjust to unemployment before turning to the woods. Others were making payments on aging pickup trucks, knowing that missing even a few days of work could bring the bank to their door. One man carried a photograph of his child in his wallet, folded so carefully the edges had worn thin. They trusted Colette not because he was rich or powerful, but because he paid on time. He took responsibility. He said the job was legal, and to them, legal meant safe. They did not think they were stepping into a gray zone of conflict where rules did not work as they did in books. In the early days, they felt the tension clearly. The forest was unusually quiet. There were watching eyes in the distance. Chainsaws were sometimes shut off abruptly at the sound of something unfamiliar, but habit and the pressure of putting food on the table pushed them onward. Staying home was not an easy option when someone was waiting for dinner. Those 13 men did not take sides in the dispute. They did not understand the contract. They did not grasp the tangled family ties. They understood only that today they had to work, and tomorrow as well, if they wanted to keep their lives from sliding backward. During short breaks, they talked about the weather, about good timber and bad, about the coming hunting season. No one spoke of the warning shot. No one spoke of fear. In Appalachia, men are taught to hide worry, because showing it does not make the meal any fuller. When they entered the forest on that fateful night, none of them believed it would be their last trip. They carried no hatred with them. They carried responsibility. And that simple, heartbreaking truth placed them at the center of a tragedy they had never created. The night of November 17th settled over Harlan County with a penetrating cold. Wind swept across the mountainsides, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and damp earth. Scattered wooden houses glowed with light. Dinner passed in heavier silence than usual, as if something unnamed were being waited for. On one side, James Wesley Colette sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the work list for the next day. He knew the situation was tense, but he believed he could not retreat any further. Stopping now would mean bankruptcy. It would mean 13 men losing their income. Colette did not see himself as a hero. He was simply a man who saw no way back. He told his wife he might be home late. She looked at him longer than usual, as if wanting to say something, then held it back. In families accustomed to living with risk, people learn not to ask too much, because the answers can be more frightening than silence. On the other side of the mountains, Dalton Hensley could not sleep either. He wiped down his old hunting rifle, his movements slow and familiar. In his mind, everything had gone too far. Warnings had been ignored, land had been trespassed, honor had been dismissed. Dalton did not think he was preparing to commit a crime. He believed he was preparing to defend. The men around Dalton gathered quietly. They did not discuss detailed plans. They did not need to. In Appalachia, many things are understood without being spoken. A glance exchanged was enough to confirm that tonight matters would be settled in their own way. No one on either side believed the night would end in blood. Each believed he had just cause. Colette trusted in responsibility. Dalton trusted in honor. And when those two beliefs could not coexist, the darkness of the mountains began to tilt toward violence. Outside, the fog thickened. The forest fell into an unnatural silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath, watching small human beings prepare to make decisions that would haunt them and Harlan County forever. Just before dawn, the Appalachian forest was still buried in heavy darkness. Fog clung low to the ground, wrapping around tree trunks like invisible mourning cloths. Footsteps crunching on dry leaves sounded faint, yet in that space, every noise felt frighteningly sharp. The 13 men following Colette moved into a forest that should have felt familiar, but that morning felt strangely foreign. Flashlights swept over stumps and narrow trails. They spoke in low voices, mostly to reassure one another that this was just an early start to a normal workday. None of them realized they were being watched. From higher ground, shadowed figures hid among the dense trees. Dalton Hensley stood among them. He watched in silence, his heart pounding, while his face remained rigid. In that moment, there was no longer family, no longer money. There was only a boundary that had been crossed, and the belief that if it was not stopped now, it would never stop at all. The first gunshot tore through the fog. No one knows who pulled the trigger first. Only that after that sound, the world seemed to collapse. Shouts erupted. Men fell. Others tried to run, but there was no clear way out. The forest, once a place of livelihood, suddenly became a deadly maze. Some tried to raise their hands, to say they were only hired workers. But in the chaos, words carried no weight. Gunfire followed in rapid bursts, slamming into the mountainsides and echoing back like funeral bells. Each shot cut a life short, leaving a family at home forever incomplete. When it was over, silence returned with terrifying speed. Gun smoke thinned in the early mist. Bodies lay still on the cold ground. Dalton and the men with him stood frozen, as if only then realizing what they had done. There was no victory, no honor restored, only 13 men who would never return home, and a forest that had witnessed the moment when human beings crossed their final boundary. On the morning of November 18, the sun rose slowly behind the Appalachian ridges. Weak light spilled into the forest, revealing what the night had concealed. A group of forestry workers arrived at the site, as they always did, carrying hot coffee and fragments of casual morning conversation. They did not know that just a few steps ahead, their lives would be divided forever into before and after. When they entered the clearing, they stopped. No one spoke. Before them lay bodies scattered across the cold ground. 13 men, motionless, terrifyingly silent. Some lay face down, others stared upward at the gray sky. The blood had already darkened, soaking into the forest floor as if it had always belonged there. The air seemed to freeze. One man turned away, trembling and wretched. Another stood rigid, gripping his hard hat, unsure whether to pray or to run. This was no accident. The way the bodies faced one another, the close-range gunshot wounds, everything spoke to a single truth. This was an ending carried out with intent. The call to the police was made in a broken voice. News spread faster than the morning fog. In scattered homes throughout the valley, telephones began to ring. Wives and mothers, not yet knowing what had happened, felt unease rush in before the words were even spoken. That morning, Harlan County woke beneath a crushing silence. This was no longer a land dispute. The raw truth had surfaced, and it was too vast, too brutal, for anyone to turn away from. Gerald Pike came to while the sky was still short of dawn. The pain in his left shoulder burned like fire driven deep into flesh, making it hard to breathe. His dark jacket was soaked with blood, cold and heavy. The most terrifying thing was not the wound, but the silence that wrapped around the forest. No more gunshots, no voices, only wind moving through the treetops, like the breath of a night that refused to let go. Gerald lay still for a long time, afraid to move. He remembered every face that had fallen men who, just hours earlier, had been talking and laughing in the glow of headlights. They were only loggers. Someone's father, someone's husband, men who had promised to be home before Thanksgiving. The thought crushed his chest more tightly than the bullet ever could. When he was certain no one else was nearby, Gerald began to crawl. Every meter forward demanded clenched teeth and sheer will. Dry leaves stuck to his blood. Cold earth seeped into his skin. He did not know how long he moved, only that if he stopped, he would die not from the wound, but from fear. When the paved road finally appeared through the morning fog, Gerald broke down. His sobs came in shards, the sound of a man who had crossed the line between life and death and somehow returned. He was the only one who survived and the one who would carry that memory for the rest of his life, a memory that would never again allow him peaceful sleep. Gerald Pike came to while the sky was still short of dawn. The pain in his left shoulder burned like fire driven deep into flesh, making it hard to breathe. His dark jacket was soaked with blood, cold and heavy. The most terrifying thing was not the wound, but the silence that wrapped around the forest. No more gunshots, no voices, only wind moving through the treetops, like the breath of a night that refused to let go. Gerald lay still for a long time, afraid to move. He remembered every face that had fallen men who, just hours earlier, had been talking and laughing in the glow of headlights. They were only loggers, someone's father, someone's husband, men who had promised to be home before Thanksgiving. The thought crushed his chest more tightly than the bullet ever could. When he was certain no one else was nearby, Gerald began to crawl. Every meter forward demanded clenched teeth and sheer will. Dry leaves stuck to his blood. Cold earth seeped into his skin. He did not know how long he moved, only that if he stopped, he would die not from the wound, but from fear. When the paved road finally appeared through the morning fog, Gerald broke down. His sobs came in shards, the sound of a man who had crossed the line between life and death and somehow returned. He was the only one who survived, and the one who would carry that memory for the rest of his life, a memory that would never again allow him peaceful sleep. When investigators entered Harlan County, they faced more than a blood-soaked crime scene. They faced a wall of silence. Winding mountain roads led them from house to house, but doors stayed closed. Eyes were averted. The same answers were repeated again and again. I didn't hear anything. I don't know anything. In Appalachia, silence is not always a lie. It is a means of survival. People learn not to speak of things that could place their families in danger. The unwritten law exists alongside the written one, and in those early days, it carried more weight than any badge. But the crime scene itself could not remain silent. Shell casings lay scattered across the forest floor. Fresh footprints pressed into the mud. Bullets embedded in tree trunks told a story of firing angles, distance, and deliberate preparation. Every small detail whispered a truth that people were trying to bury. Gerald Pike began to speak. His voice shook, but each sentence was clear. He spoke not out of hatred, but for those who no longer had a voice. When his testimony met forensic evidence, the silence began to crack. Inside the cold interrogation rooms, the truth slowly took shape. It was no longer a mountain rumor passed from mouth to mouth, but a reality that could not be denied. And from that moment on, Harlan County understood that some crimes, no matter how deeply buried beneath culture and fear, will eventually be dragged into the light. The trial opened in the middle of summer, yet the air inside the courtroom felt cold as stone. The people of Harlan County filled the benches, their gazes split into two sides. On one sat the families of the 13 victims, carrying framed photographs and a grief still too raw to name. On the other were the relatives of Dalton Hensley, familiar mountain faces who believed their man had only done what had to be done. When Gerald Pike took the witness stand, the room fell silent. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from memories returning with brutal clarity. Each sentence seemed to pull the night of November 17th back into the room. Some lowered their heads, others turned away. No one could escape the feeling that the truth itself was standing among them. The defense spoke of honor, of the right to protect land, of a man pushed to the edge. The prosecutor spoke of ambush, of execution-style gunfire, of a boundary that had been crossed beyond return. The same story, told two different ways, ways that would never meet. Outside the courthouse, people argued about right and wrong. Inside, the jury listened and weighed every detail. When the verdict was read, there were no cheers, only choked sobs and faces gone rigid. It followed Harlan County back into the mountains, where justice and honor have always stood at opposite ends of a road that is never straight. After the trial, Harlan County returned to its old rhythm, but nothing was whole again. The mountain road still twisted as before, the forests remained green. Yet, inside every home, there was an emptiness that could not be filled. 13 men were gone, leaving behind dinner tables with missing chairs and children growing up with memories of fathers who would never come home. Those who remained learned to live with the pain. Some left their homeland, carrying wounds no one could see. Others stayed, passing the old forest each day, where wind moving through the trees sounded like whispers from the past. No one spoke much about that night, but everyone remembered it. Dalton Hensley sat behind bars. The honor he believed he had defended, shattered along with the lives taken. Gerald Pike went on living, but every sleep was haunted by gunshots in his dreams. And the disputed land, in the end, was still sold a bitter reminder that bloodshed had preserved nothing at all. The massacre ended, but its echo did not. It lingered in the eyes of the people, in the hesitation whenever law and honor were mentioned together. A story with no winners, only losses stretching across generations, quiet yet heavy, like the Appalachian Mountains themselves. When the story closes, what lingers is not the sound of gunfire, but the quiet questions left behind. If there had been one more conversation, would blood have been shed? If the law had arrived sooner, would honor have needed to be defended with human lives? If each person had stepped back just once, would 13 families still be whole? No one in this story set out to become a killer or a victim. They were ordinary people, pressed into a narrow corner by poverty, pride, and the fear of being trampled. In the decisive moment, the easiest choice became the most brutal one. The Appalachian forest still stands silent and enduring. It does not judge. It does not condemn. Only people are left to question themselves. Where does justice truly lie? How much is honor worth? And when everything has gone too far, is there any path back that does not demand lives in return? These questions have no answers, but they will remain for a long time yet in the memory of the mountains and in the minds of everyone who listens to this story.